The Pimax Crystal Super is finally here, and after spending 10 to 14 hours per day testing it in detail, I have some thoughts. I also asked you guys on Reddit what you wanted to know, where I got nearly 60,000 views and more than 200 questions that I'll be answering in this video. And beef swizzle, a promise is a promise. There you go. Okay, so let's break it down with the good and the bad and see if this thing is all that Pimax promised, and for the price tag, it better be. I'll be testing everything, doing benchmarks in popular VR games, and answering as many of your Reddit questions as possible. Now, I won't bore you with the full specs, just pause here if you want to have a look, but I do need to mention one that is just crazy. The Super's native render resolution, as reported by SteamVR, is 6240 by 6280 pixels per eye, which amounts to a total of, get this, 12,480 by 6,080 pixels, which is the highest, most ridiculous resolution I've ever heard of, and pretty much the definition of overkill for the current generation of GPUs. But it does have a few tricks up its sleeve to increase performance, which we'll be going over a bit later. Now, to be clear, this is before the distortion profiles are applied, so the actual resolution you're seeing in the headset is 3840 by 3840 per eye, which is still incredible, but we need to address the elephant in the room. Go away. What kind of alien technology do you need in your PC to actually run this? Because let me tell you, my 4090 is gasping for air here. So let's start with a few benchmarks, and later on I'll go over comfort, field of view, binocular overlap, and all or most of the questions I got on Reddit, as well as some negatives you need to be aware of. The first set of benchmarks is running at full native resolution and in-game settings maxed out with no dynamic foveated rendering, reprojection, or smoothing shenanigans. My test system for these is an AMD 7950X3D processor, 32 gigs of RAM, and a stock non-overclocked Asus RTX 4090. Now, this will just act as a baseline benchmark, and I'm also recording in 1440p 60fps at the same time, but I wanted to see how far off we are from hitting that 90Hz refresh rate, and then we'll try to optimize performance and find the sweet spot between visuals and frame rate. Starting off with Aircar, this is one of my go-to games for testing both visuals and performance. Now, all in-game settings are maxed out, and we're getting an average of around 58 FPS, which is honestly way better than I was expecting. Then let's move over to Kayak VR Mirage, where things weren't quite as good. Again, all in-game settings are set to the maximum, and as you can see, we're struggling around 36 to 37 FPS here, so we'll have to see what can be done to improve that, because it's below what I'd consider acceptable even for a slower paced game like this. Next up, Contractor Showdown, and once again things here take a turn for the worst. This was really rough to experience, hovering around 17 to 18 FPS on ultra settings with constant stutters. The average FPS you're seeing is calculating what I was getting in the pre-game menu, where I was at 90, but once in game I barely saw over 19 or 20 frames per second. Ugh, lots of work to do here. Now on Reddit, this fine gentleman here requested Skyrim VR with the Mad God Overhaul mod pack, and I actually tried both vanilla Skyrim VR as well as the modded version. Let's check them out, and then we'll move on to some sim racing and flight sim titles. Skyrim Vanilla really surprised me. I was expecting it to run like absolute crap, but even on this crazy resolution, I got over 60 FPS constantly, with the average around 63 to 64. And yeah, I realize it was just the very start of the game and not a super busy area, but still. Now, when it comes to the Mad God Overhaul version, nearly 2,000 mods make performance take a huge toll, so I was only getting about half of the vanilla version FPS at 30 to 35 frames. Okay, time for some Automobilista 2, which was also requested on Reddit. Let me tell you, 21 to 22 FPS in a sim racing title is not fun at all. But to be fair, ultra settings at this render resolution was gonna be rough, and I should have seen this coming. And for good measure, let's also check out Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 as well as DCS World. Starting off with MSFS, I couldn't even start it, like at all. Whenever I switched to VR, the FPS would go down to 1. Yes, 1 frame per second. And my PC would freeze to a point where I had to turn it off by long holding the power button like a savage. I think I tried to get it working for 2 hours, including on the lowest possible settings in game, still nothing. In DCS, the first try was exactly the same as MSFS 2024. I tried running it with high settings and yeah, 1 FPS. But thankfully with the default VR preset, it worked and I was hovering around 36 FPS with a surprising average of 39. Not too bad actually, and the cockpit looked incredible playable in such high resolution. Okay, now that we have a baseline while running all these at the absolute maximum, let's see what we can do to actually make them playable without sacrificing too much visual quality, cause no one's spending this kind of money to get Quest 2 graphics. The most obvious thing to try first is to take advantage of the built-in eye tracking and use dynamic foveated rendering to see how much of a bump we can get. Pimax has a feature called Central Priority Rendering, so with that on as well as eye tracking enabled, let's go over the games one more time. And remember, we're still at full native resolution here. Aircar is definitely taking major advantage of this feature, with clarity still being exactly the same, which is to say excellent, but now with a rock-solid 80 FPS, so about a 38% increase in performance. Not bad, Pimax, not bad. Now in Kayak VR, I didn't see much of an uplift in frame rate, so I guess it doesn't play nice with foveated rendering techniques, because while I did get 42 to 44 FPS, this was just a measly 16% increase. Decent, but definitely nothing major. Moving on to Contractor's Showdown, here there was basically no benefit at all to turning on those settings in Pimax Play, because I got pretty much the exact same results as I did with them off. Skyrim VR Vanilla though was again one of the titles that benefits from these settings, because I was at over 80 FPS consistently, which felt and looked great. For the modded version, it was roughly the same difference as before, getting maybe a little over half the frame rate compared to vanilla. But the eye tracking was causing some very nasty and distracting artifacts. Basically, textures were popping in and out depending on where I was looking, and it was just a bad experience using eye tracking. Now, if there's something I'm missing, please let me know in the comments, because in Automobilista 2, the performance is actually a bit worse now. I ran the test 3 times with PC restarts in between, and they were identical all 3 times. For MSFS 2024, no change here, still could not switch to VR mode without my PC packing its bags and showing me the finger. Spoiler, I did manage to get it running in the 3rd set of benchmarks, where the goal was to get good, stable frame rates. DCS with Pimax Central Priority Rendering had a small 9 to 10% uplift in performance, now hitting around 40 FPS. But DCS runs way better with the quad views implementation of dynamic foveated rendering, much better actually. Now I had to switch the FPS counter to the in-game one because this is running through Pimax's OpenXR runtime and FPS VR only works on Steam VR apparently. Anyway, I was getting 65 to 70 FPS with this method, which is a nearly 95% increase. But I still wasn't happy with the performance in most of these games, and I know a lot of you asked how the Crystal Super looks and runs at low resolutions too. So on to round 3 of the benchmarks, and then we'll move on to visuals, comfort and other stuff, I promise. So I lowered the render resolution in Pimax Play to 75%, which amounts to 4680 by 4708 pixels per eye in Steam VR. Still a lot of res, but should give us a bit of wiggle room when it comes to performance, and if we need a bit more, I'll make adjustments within the game settings. Once again, starting with Aircar, which I left on max settings in game, we are at an absolutely rock solid 90 FPS, and this still looks gorgeous. And to my eyes, the decrease in sharpness definitely feels like less than 25%. This was a good start, but let's move on to Kayak VR. After some testing, I realized I can leave the settings to Ultra and still get around 80 FPS, even closer to 90 in some smaller areas. That's an average of over 100% gains by just lowering the resolution to 75%. It still looks fantastic, definitely better than the Crystal Lite, and while we're not at a solid 90 FPS, 80 to 85 feels perfect for this particular game. In Showdown, with everything left to Ultra, we're getting double the frame rate, but 35 FPS is still horrible for a game where reaction time is essential, so I jumped into the settings to see what I can do. With the in-game resolution setting on high instead of ultra and the rest on medium, the game still looked very good and we're finally getting a steady 80 to 90 frames per second. For vanilla Skyrim VR, as expected since we were already getting 80 FPS, it's now at 90 with 0 dips, which means we could probably even get away with 85% resolution on the unmodded version. And on the pretty crazy Mad God Overhaul one, the eye tracking issues were even worse, and it's also showing up in the recording now. At least the frame rate was between 60 and 70 FPS, but as you can see, the visual artifacts are not worth the performance gains. Unless there's something I'm not aware of here, I would not recommend using this type of dynamic foveated rendering with modded Skyrim VR. On Automobilista 2, the lower 75% render resolution was not nearly low enough to get good performance, and I was still getting under 40 FPS. So I had to tweak the in-game settings and take them down from ultra to a combination of medium and high, and was now getting around 70 FPS. This starts to be decent, but I still need to mess with it more because on multiplayer races it will tank a lot more. So I need to see that solid 90 at least in single player. So if AMS2 is your jam, be prepared to likely have to go to about 60% render resolution, and that's assuming you have a 4090 GPU, so kinda rough here. Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 was not great either, getting roughly 40 frames per second with every setting on low, which definitely took away from how good this game looks, especially when it comes to the environment. I will need to do more testing to see what can be done to get it higher, so if anyone knows some good tips and tricks, let me know in the comments please. And finally, DCS was now netting around 76 FPS average, and that's while running it in the Steam VR mode. So by using quad views and OpenXR instead, 80 to 90 FPS is very realistic, even in busy areas. With the benchmarks out of the way, let's talk about visuals, field of view, binocular overlap, and answer some more of your questions from Reddit. Let's jump into both Test HMD and WinFOV and run some tests. Starting with the field of view test in Test HMD, I got 126 degrees horizontal and 102 vertical. So while not quite as high as Pimax claimed, it's a very good result and will be different for everyone. Sadly, I already had a feeling that binocular overlap wasn't great, and the WinFOV test confirmed my suspicions, resulting in a 78.89% stereo overlap, which, while not horrible, also isn't great by any means. Now, I'm not smart enough to know if that's close to the claimed 105 degrees that Pimax mentioned, so if anyone knows how to compare an overlap percentage to one in degrees, please enlighten my dumbass. Now the Reddit questions on the visual topic, starting with a popular one. Yes, there is Mura present, but it's only visible when really looking for it in very bright scenes. If you've ever tried a PSVR 2, I'd say it's about 90% less than that. Does lowering the brightness help? Well, yes, but again, even at 100% brightness, which is extremely bright, it's barely noticeable and I wouldn't consider it a cause for concern. Are there any geometric distortions or eye strain? Now, there was some distortion when I tried it at CES, but I'm happy to report that it has been 100% solved and I see no distortion whatsoever, nor do I get any eye strain, which is definitely something I experienced on the OG Crystal. Look for tiger stripes and/or shadows, especially in bright areas like skies. Now, I don't know exactly what that means because tiger stripes and Mura can be perceived as the same thing, so as I mentioned earlier, yes, there is a tiny bit of that, but very hard to notice unless you're specifically looking for it in very bright and uniform color spots like the sky, while kind of doing micro head movements like this. And again, I don't consider it an issue at all. Please test dark, low light scenes with no bright elements present. Okay, WrongQuail8303, this is a great opportunity to test out both glare and local dimming, so thank you for that. Starting off with glare, I used the glare test in Test HMD as well as MSFS 2024 at nighttime, and I'm extremely impressed and happy to report there is literally zero glare. When it comes to local dimming and black levels, I usually keep it on the balance settings in my Crystal Light, but unfortunately I can't do that yet with the Super. As per my understanding, it's just set to the maximum by default for now, with the option to adjust it coming later to Pimax Play. In Kayak VR on the nighttime jungle area, the shadows are definitely darker than I would have liked, with the details being crushed more than they should be. Based on my experience with the Crystal Light, this should be solved when we can set the local dimming to balanced, but I can't test that yet. I have to say that the black levels are excellent though, getting dangerously close to OLED levels. The visuals are overall really good in dark scenes, and I think they could be excellent with the local dimming set to balanced. Now Douglas asked me to check for color and brightness differences between the lenses, and there's none that I can notice, but Pimax knew who they were sending this Super to, so I'm not sure how relevant it is for my particular unit. It will be more down to their overall quality control process than anything else, so I'd keep an eye out for more reports from actual customers. And a big one from SimVR Racing: weight distribution and comfort, chromatic aberrations, and sweet spot positioning. Now, I'll cover comfort in the next section, so let's discuss the other two. There is some chromatic aberration at the very edge of the lens's left and right sides on the last about 1 to 2% of the horizontal field of view. Now, it's not by any means the worst I've seen, and at least for me it's not distracting or immersion breaking. This also takes into consideration the next point about the sweet spot, edge-to-edge clarity, and to quote SimVR Racing, how long it takes to faff around getting it lined up properly. The lenses have a massive sweet spot, and with the large field of view, it's very refreshing to just be able to look around using your eyes, especially things like just glancing at the mirror while racing or keeping an eye out for enemies during a dogfight in DCS. And Rara GT, Isamu 999 and Summers. Don't worry, I have a section later on productivity and media that will cover desktop use, reading, and movies. To give you some estimates on the sweet spot, I would say about 95% of the lens is crystal clear, with the last 5% getting a bit blurry, which I would consider very good. All this being said, the amount of faffing around needed to position this correctly is minimal, but with a big caveat, which perfectly leads us into the comfort section, where I'll explain this as well. So kicking off the comfort side of things with weight and balance. The headset is 975 grams with the stock S-Mass speakers, and the D-Mass audio adds an extra 100 grams, so 1075 on the version I have. But it's actually a tiny bit more than that, and this leads me into the sweet spot positioning caveat I mentioned a moment ago. The top strap is absolutely essential for this headset to be comfortable, and yes, it might add a few extra grams on top of an already pretty heavy headset, but at least for me it takes it from a 6 out of 10 I kinda need a break every hour, to a 9 out of 10 I could wear this all day headset. While it is definitely still a hefty headset, the top strap makes the weight distribution a million times better for my head shape and prevents the headset from resting on my nose and cheeks. Which did happen without it, where no matter how tight I had it on, it would slowly slide down and end up putting pressure on those areas. Now, the issue is completely gone with this, which is why I even told Pimax that including this with all orders moving forward is a must. And I guess this is as good of a moment as any to also answer the other question that Douglas had. The cable is 5 meters in length, and while I couldn't properly measure the weight, I will say it's a thick boy, so if you have the option to use a pulley system, I think this will help with comfort a lot. And I haven't forgotten my promise, Bongaddy. The dial on the back sticks out about 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches from the cushion. Hopefully that helps. Let's briefly go over audio as it ties into the next section, so Summers, we're almost there, bud. The D-Mass audio is the same as the one on the Crystal and Crystal Light, and it sounds just as good with great bass, good positional accuracy, and it's just overall a great audio solution in my opinion. And back to our buddy Douglas, who's asking about audio delay. I tried it in the Pavlov shooting range and there is no perceivable audio delay. And since we're here, let's do a quick microphone test. This is a microphone test using the built-in microphone on the Pimax Crystal Super. Now, there's also a dog barking outside, so I don't know if you can hear that. We can also test the noise cancelling. Mic check, test, 1, 2, 3. I think the perfect scientific term to describe the microphone quality is meh. It's not bad, but it's not winning any prizes here either. With this crazy high resolution, it's definitely worth discussing what the Crystal Super is like as a monitor replacement as well as for watching movies. Now, as a disclaimer, I very rarely use VR for productivity work, so if I'm not using the best apps to test this, let me know in the comments and I can try out other options and let you know in a reply. I tried this with both Pimax's own option as well as within the Steam VR dashboard. And while the text is very easily readable and sharpness is good, it's just not as sharp as the text in native VR apps like Test HMD or games. When it comes to watching movies, I tried big screen and I've gotta say it looks amazing. Everything is super sharp, and with the wide FOV it means even environments with huge screens are easily viewable without moving your head, so yeah, this is an excellent movie watching headset. Okay, let's talk negatives, and these are going to be ones that don't necessarily fit into any of the other categories I've already covered. The Crystal Super gets pretty hot to the touch and pretty fast, especially on the top side. Now, this didn't translate to it being warm on my face, but I thought it is worth mentioning as I'm not sure if this can affect it long term. Very likely related to this is also the fact that there is an audible fan noise that sometimes briefly turns into a slight coil whine, similar to what you would get from some GPUs. Of course, it will be much quieter than that since the fans are way smaller, but it was a bit annoying when no audio was playing through the speakers, and once I was in game I couldn't hear it, but again, worth mentioning. Now, a really annoying thing that I'm sure will be easily fixed via software is the fact that it forgets your room settings every single time, and I find myself below floor level, so I have to go in and do it all over again. Not the end of the world, but come on, Pimax. Worth noting though that I was using an unreleased version of Pimax Play, so it's possible this issue will be gone in the public one, but I had to talk about it. Last but not least in terms of negatives, which is not as much related to Pimax but rather the QLED screens they're using in the Super. For about 5 to 8 minutes after turning on, there is visible ghosting on the image. This is due to the fact that they take a while to warm up, and once they do, any sign of ghosting is gone. So if you're getting a Super soon, just be aware of that and don't judge it strictly based on the first few minutes of play. In practice, this was rarely an issue in games, since by the time you open up Steam VR, open what you want to play, navigate the menus, and reach the actual game, the screens have pretty much warmed up and they're good to go. But again, I always want to give you the full picture, so I thought it was worth noting. So is the Crystal Super worth upgrading to if you already have a Crystal or Crystal Lite? Now, a lot of comments on Reddit ask this, including how the visuals compare to the Crystal Lite when running at the same resolution, so I'll go through that right now. The main benefits of the Super over the Crystal or Crystal Lite are not actually tied to resolution, though that will play a role in future-proofing your investment. But for now, the most significant things are the new lenses, the brightness of the screens, and the field of view. All these are considerably better than both the other two headsets, and if visuals are your top priority, then yes. Even while running this at the same resolution, this is a big upgrade in clarity, contrast, and overall visuals. Other aspects worth noting are that I find the Super much more comfortable, provided that you also use the top strap as I mentioned earlier. And to make sure I cover everything asked on Reddit, specifically comparing this to the OG Crystal, the lack of a battery in the Super is already a massive benefit on top of what I've already mentioned. And when looking at the Crystal Lite, eye tracking is a major one, as you've seen in the benchmarks and the performance section earlier. So what do I think of the Crystal Super? Well, the visuals are outstanding and it's without a doubt the absolute best image quality I've ever seen. As an overall package, it's extremely compelling from a hardware perspective. That's not to say the software is bad, because I've genuinely had absolutely no issues with Pimax Play, no disconnections or glitches, so good job Pimax on finally getting it to this point. But I can't ignore the price tag on this thing, which needs to be heavily taken into consideration if you're thinking of getting one. For updated pricing, there's an affiliate link below with a bit of a discount included, which helps support me to continue making these in-depth videos, but only use it if you want to. So if you can afford this without having to eat ramen for the next 6 months, then it's an excellent headset, and if you've already pre-ordered it, I don't see how anyone could be unhappy with the quality that the Crystal Super offers. But if this feels like too much of an investment, or anything I've mentioned today is a deal breaker, then I think the Crystal Lite will continue to be a fantastic choice for most people, and it will be sold alongside the Super as part of Pimax's lineup for the foreseeable future. Also, don't worry if I haven't mentioned your Reddit comment in this video, because I took note of every single one, and I have a few other videos about the Crystal Super planned, including more benchmarks specifically for sim racing games, as well as diving deeper into the performance optimization side of things and testing it on lower-end GPUs, and even a dedicated comparison between the Super and the Crystal Lite. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this, and leave any questions or thoughts in the comments, or even just an emoji to help with YouTube engagement. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you soon. Cheers, guys!